In the autumn of 1882, the people of the Antelope Fork Basin in the Dakota Territory watched a shepherd do something that made no sense. While every sensible family was chinking their cabins with mud and moss, splitting cord after cord of stovewood, and stacking plank fences against the wind, Caleb Renner was tearing the inner wall off his own house. He pried the boards loose one by one, stacked them in the yard, and into the hollow space he had opened, he began stuffing raw, greasy, unwashed sheep wool by the armload. Fleece still smelling of the animal. Fleece nobody in the valley would have paid a nickel for. He packed it tight between the logs and the boards, then nailed the wall shut over it, and started on the next one. His daughter Nell, 8 years old and small for it, carried the loose fleece to him in a willow basket nearly as big as she was. A black and white collie named Pitch trotted the wall line beside her, nose to every gap. By the second day, the men hauling wood past the Renner fence had slowed their wagons to look. By the third, they had a word for it. They called the Renner place the Wool House. And they did not say it kindly. Because on the frontier, every short autumn day was too precious to waste, and a man pulling his own house apart to fill it with dirty fleece looked less like a man preparing for winter than a man who had given up on it. Was Caleb Renner burying his daughter in something that would warm them through the worst the Dakota sky could send? Or had grief finally turned his hands against the only shelter they had? Don't let Caleb and Nell face that winter alone. Hit like and subscribe to warm up their journey of survival, because what the Valley laughed at in October, they would be begging to understand by January. The man who said it loudest was Dorsey Flint. Flint had built more houses in Antelope Fork than any man living. He had raised the church, the schoolhouse, half the cabins on the South Road, and he carried his 30 years of carpentry the way some men carry a badge. He reined up at Caleb's fence on a gray afternoon, watched the shepherd nail a board over a wall stuffed with fleece, and shook his head slowly. "Wool rots, Renner," he said. "It'll mold inside that wall before Christmas. You'll have mice nesting in your logs by spring, and the wet of it'll rot the timber straight through. A wall's meant to be solid. You're filling yours with garbage." Caleb set another nail and drove it. He did not look up. It kept the sheep warm enough, he said, on the hill, in the snow. The sheep had each other, Flint said, and they had hides. You've got a little girl and a dead man's notions. That landed, and Flint knew it. He clicked his tongue and rode on. Behind him the words hung in the cold air, because the valley knew the truth in them. Caleb Renner had buried his wife Hannah the winter before. A lung fever that came on in December and took her by the new year, in a cabin that never seemed to hold its heat, no matter how hard he fed the stove. He had sat up the last 3 nights of her life feeding that firebox, watching the frost crawl up the inside of the north wall not 3 feet from where she lay, and he had understood helplessly that the cold was getting to her faster than the fire could push it back. He had not been able to keep his own wife warm in his own house. The valley remembered it. So did he. Flint was only the first. The scorn came down the road behind him in waves, the way it always does once one respected man has given it permission. The next was Asa Quill, the supply credit man who kept the ledger for half the families in the basin, and who saw in the wool house not a fool, but a bad risk. He came to the fence with his book under his arm and asked Caleb flatly how a man who tore his own shelter apart in October meant to pay his credit if he froze out before spring and lost his flock. A wall full of garbage was not collateral, Quill said, and he made a small mark in his ledger beside the Renner name that everyone in Antelope Fork knew the meaning of. Caleb said nothing. He had nothing to put against a man's arithmetic, but a thing the man would not believe until he felt it. The third was worse, because the third was the church. The valley had a part-time preacher, a stern, well-meaning man named Reverend Ott, who came out on a Sunday afternoon under the pretense of comfort and stayed to deliver a warning. He had heard, he said, that grief did strange things to a man's reason. He had heard Caleb spoke to the dead woman's mother as though her foreign superstitions were gospel. He hoped, for the child's sake, that Caleb had not let sorrow lead him into something that would put little Nell in the ground beside her mother before the spring thaw. It was kindly meant, and it cut to the bone, because it named the exact fear Caleb woke with in the black of every morning, that he had it wrong, that his grief had finally turned his own hands against his own child. He thanked the Reverend for his concern, and he walked back to the wall, and he kept packing fleece. Because the alternative to trusting the old woman was trusting the kind of solid, handsome wall that had already failed him once beside a bed in the dark. That night Nell sat on the floor by the half-finished wall, pulling burrs from Pitch's coat, and she asked the question children ask. "Will the wool really stop the winter, Papa?" "No," Caleb said. He was quiet a moment. "Just part of it, the part that matters most." She waited for more, the way she always did. He almost left it there. Then he set down his hammer, and he told her about her grandmother. Hannah's mother had come from the high country of the old world, from a cold that made Dakota look soft, and she had kept her family alive through winters that killed whole villages. When Caleb was first married, the old woman had stood in his drafty cabin, pressed her palm flat to the wall, and felt the cold leaking through the chinking like water through a civet. She had clicked her tongue at him then, too, and she had told him a thing he never forgot. "The cold is not the killer," she had said. "Moving air is the killer. A wall that lets the air walk through it will never hold heat, no matter how hot you build the fire. You do not need a stronger wall, you need a still one." She had picked up a handful of fleece from his lambing pile, the same greasy wool the valley sneered at, and she had pulled it apart in her fingers so he could see. Not the wool itself, the 1,000 tiny pockets of trapped air caught inside the crimp of every fiber. "This is not warmth," she had said. "This is a wall full of held breath. Stuff your house with held breath, and the cold can find no road through it. A wall full of held breath." Caleb had laughed at the old woman, the way the valley was laughing at him now. Then he had watched his wife shiver to death in a solid, handsome, well-built house with frost on its inner wall, and he had stopped laughing forever. Still air. That was the whole of it. The fire did not need to be bigger. The heat the fire made simply needed somewhere to stay, instead of being snatched away through the logs the moment it rose. The valley packed its walls with mud, and mud was solid, and solid let the cold march straight across it. Wool did the opposite. Wool was almost nothing but the air caught inside it, and trapped air was the finest blanket there was. The cold could not walk through a thing that gave it no road. It could only sit at the outside of the wall and grow tired. So Caleb did not build a stronger house. He built a still one. He opened each wall, packed a cavity with fleece pressed firm but never crushed, because crushed wool lost its air, and a crushed wall was no better than a mud one, and he sealed it behind the boards. He did the floor next, lifting the planks and laying a thick mat of fleece across the joists before he nailed them back. Cold came up from the frozen ground as surely as it came through the walls, and a cold floor stole the warmth from a sleeping body all night long. He did the ceiling last because heat rose, and the heat that rose into a bare roof was heat the fire had made for nothing. He stuffed the rafters tight and boarded them over. There was more to it than stuffing a cavity, and Caleb learned the rest the way the old woman had learned it, by feel and by failure. The fleece nearest the stove he packed a little looser, because the heat would dry it, and dry wool held its air best. Along the cold north and west walls he laid it deeper, because that was where winter would press hardest. He kept the greasy lanolin in the wool instead of washing it out the way a tidy man would have, because the grease shed water, and wool that shed water never went sodden, and wool that never went sodden never rotted the way Dorsey Flint had promised it would. Every objection the valley had raised, the old woman's method had already answered, generations before Antelope Fork ever had a name. The mice that Flint swore would nest in it never came, because Caleb scattered dried wormwood and cedar shavings through the fleece as he packed, the way his wife's mother had taught him, and the smell of it kept the mice in the barn where they belonged. Nell helped at all of it. She carried the fleece, she held the boards. She learned without being taught that you pressed the wool firm and never stomped it, and her small hands were good at working it into the corners his big ones could not reach. She was the one who found the gaps. He would pack a section, and she would crawl along the base of it with a candle, watching the flame, and where it leaned she would call out, and he would open it and pack it tighter. The two of them worked through the short afternoons and into the lamplit evenings, the man and the small girl and the dog asleep by the door, building a thing nobody else in the basin believed in. Slow work, careful work. It took the better part of 3 weeks, and the whole valley watched and shook its heads, and Dorsey Flint rode past every few days to see how the foolishness was coming along. Then the first real test came, and it nearly proved Flint right. It was the last week of October when a hard north wind came down the basin ahead of the season, the first true gale of the year, and Caleb stood inside his finished house and felt the cold finding a way in. A thin, mean draft sliding along the floor near the north corner. He found it with a wet finger and traced it to the bottom of the north wall where the fleece had settled. Wool packed loose at the top will sag with its own weight over a few weeks, and a gap had opened along the upper third of that wall, a hand's width of empty air where the cold poured through and ran down the inside of the boards to the floor. The old woman's warning rang in his head. A wall is only as still as its weakest gap. One open seam, and the cold has its road. He did not panic. He read it. He pried the north wall open again at the top, in the dark, by lantern light, while Nell slept, and he saw exactly what had happened and exactly how to stop it from happening again. He repacked the cavity, but this time he nailed thin wooden battens crosswise inside the wall every 2 feet, little shelves to hold the fleece up and keep it from settling. He did the same to the other 3 walls before they could fail the same way. It cost him 2 nights and most of his lantern oil. When the next gale came through a week later, he walked the inside of every wall with a candle. And the flame did not so much as lean. The house was still, truly still now. The near failure had taught him the one thing the wool alone could not, and the wall was stronger for having been wrong once. November came in gray and got grayer. And then, near the middle of the month, the basin went quiet in a way the old hands did not like. The wind died first. For 2 days there was no wind at all, which in Dakota in November was its own kind of warning. the sky holding its breath. The birds went next, whole strings of them crossing the basin low and southward and not stopping. Caleb's small flock, the dozen ewes he had left, crowded into the lee of the barn and would not graze. Pitch would not settle. The dog paced the door and whined at the north window and pressed himself against Nell's legs. And the sky over the northern ridge turned the color of a healing bruise, a yellow-gray wall of cloud that did not move and did not break and only thickened hour by hour until it seemed to lean over the whole basin. Old Tom Bessie, who had freighted the basin for 40 years and read weather the way other men read Scripture, rode the South Road that afternoon, telling every family he passed to lay in fuel and water and not to go out once it started. He stopped at Caleb's fence. He did not laugh at the wool house. He looked at the smooth, boarded walls a long moment, and he looked at the bruised sky. And all he said was, "You'll find out soon enough if your grandmother was right." Then he rode on to warn the next family, faster than before. That same afternoon, Dorsey Flint rode past the Renner fence one final time before the storm closed the road, and this time he did not shake his head. He slowed his wagon, and he looked at the smooth boarded wool house standing quiet under the bruised sky. And something crossed his weathered face that was not scorn and was not quite worry, but was close kin to both. He had built solid all his life. He had looked at that yellow-gray wall of cloud leaning over the ridge, and for the first time he found himself wondering, against 30 years of certainty, whether solid was going to be enough. He did not say anything to the shepherd. He clicked to his team and hurried home to feed his stove and pray his walls would hold, and that small, silent doubt was the first crack in the carpenter's certainty. Caleb made his last preparations. He carried in every stick of wood he could fit along the wall, filled every vessel he owned with water from the well before it could freeze solid, and brought the dozen ewes and pitch into the lean till he had built against the south wall, where the animals' own bodies would add their warmth to the house. He stuffed rolled fleece into the gap under the door and along the window frames the last small roads the cold might find. He pressed his palm flat to the inner north wall, the way the old woman had taught him, and felt it cool but dry. No leak, no breath of moving air. Then he barred the door, and he and Nell and the dog waited. The storm hit at dusk on the 18th of November, and it hit like the end of the world. The wind came back all at once, not building but arriving, a wall of it that struck the house with a sound like a freight train and did not let up. With it came the snow, not falling but flying sideways, so thick that when Caleb cracked the shutter to look there was nothing to see but a roaring gray-white nothing, and the cold behind it was a cold that killed. The thermometer that hung by the door, the one luxury he owned, dropped past anything he had a number for. The blizzard of November 1882 would be talked about in the Dakota Territory for 50 years. It blew for 3 full days and 3 nights without a single hour's pause, 60 and 70 miles an hour, and it buried the Antelope Fork Basin under feet of snow and erased it from the world. In the cabins along the South Road, the Doubters were learning what Caleb had learned in his wife's last winter. Dorsey Flint had built his house solid and handsome, mud-chinked and tight-jointed, and he fed his stove until the iron of it glowed, and still the frost crawled up the inside of his north wall and the water bucket skinned over with ice 8 feet from the fire. His family slept in every coat they owned, in one bed, under every blanket in the house, and woke shuddering. The fire roared and the heat went straight out through the solid walls as fast as he could make it. Because solid walls give the cold its road, and by the second night Flint was burning his fence rails because his stacked cord was already half gone and the storm was nowhere near finished. Up and down the basin it was the same. 41 degrees inside, with a stove going full in house after house. The wind found every wall and walked through it and carried the heat away into the dark, and the families huddled and shivered and fed their fires and watched their fuel shrink and prayed for a dawn that did not come. Asa Quill, the ledger man, learned what his arithmetic was worth against the Dakota wind. He had built a fine house on the strength of other men's credit, and his fine house betrayed him on the second night when the chinking cracked and fell out of the seams with the cold, and the wind came through the gaps it left as if the walls were not there at all. He nailed quilts over the inside of the worst wall and watched them go stiff with frost. Whatever mark he had made beside the Renner name in his book meant nothing now, because the only collateral that mattered in that storm was held breath, and he had none. And Reverend Ott, who had come to warn a grieving man against foreign superstition, spent the worst of those 3 nights on his knees in front of a failing stove, not in prayer, but in a desperate effort to coax more heat from green wood that hissed and smoked and would not catch, while his own breath hung visible in the air of his own house, and the cold that he had assured Caleb was nothing for a faithful man to fear reached for his family through every solid well-meaning. Mud-packed wall he owned. In the wool house it was 64 degrees. Caleb Renner sat by his stove with a small, steady fire in it, smaller than the fire that was failing to save Dorsey Flint a half-mile away, and the house held the heat like a cupped hand holds water. The walls were still. The cold sat outside them, all that screaming wind and killing snow. And it could find no road through the held breath packed inside the logs, and so it could only press at the outside of the house and grow tired. The floor was warm under Nell's feet where she slept. The ceiling held the heat down instead of letting it rise away, and as the snow itself piled up against the walls and over the roof, it became a second blanket atop the first, dead air on dead air, until the house sat inside the storm like a seed inside a drift, untouched at its center. Caleb fed the stove twice a day and no more. He had wood to spare. He milked nothing, he hauled nothing, he only kept the small fire burning and watched his daughters sleep warm in a house the whole valley had called madness. On the second night, when the wind was loudest and the cold outside had reached a depth that would freeze a man dead in minutes, Nell woke and lay listening to the storm tearing at the walls a few feet from her bed, and she was afraid. She asked her father if the wind was going to get in. Caleb took her small hand and pressed it flat against the inner wall beside her, the way the old woman had once pressed his, and he held it there until she felt it. Warm, dry, still, the whole murdering storm on the other side of a few inches of held breath, and not one finger of it reaching through. The wind cannot get in, he told her. It does not have a road. And the child believed the wall under her hand more than she believed the storm, and she slept. The smoke from his chimney rose thin and straight and calm in the few moments the wind let up, while along the south road the chimneys roared and poured. Pitch slept stretched out on the warm floor by the stove, with the ewes bedded down beside him in the lean-to, their breath fogging gently, and the held breath in the walls did its silent work, hour after hour, day after day. The harder the snow piled against the house, the warmer the house became, because the drift itself was full of trapped air, a second wall of stillness laid over the first by the very storm that meant to kill them. Nature had arrived in Antelope Fork to judge every choice every family had made that autumn, and nature never argued and never explained. It only delivered its verdict, and the verdict on the wool house was warmth. On the fourth morning, the wind finally died, and the sun came up on a basin, buried and blinding and silent. Dorsey Flint dug himself out of his own door because the drift had sealed it shut. His fuel was gone, his fence was gone, his family had survived the last night wrapped together in a single bed with the lamp oil burned for what little heat a flame could give. He was a proud man and a frightened one, and he did the only thing a man in his condition could do. He broke a path through the snow toward the nearest chimney, still showing thin, calm smoke. And that chimney was the wool house. He came up the buried fence line with frost in his beard and his breath tearing, and Caleb opened the door to him before he could knock. The warmth that rolled out of that house stopped Dorsey Flint in the snow. He stood in the doorway and felt it on his frozen face, 64 degrees, the warmth of a spring afternoon, and behind it a little girl sat on a warm floor brushing a dog. And a small fire ticked quietly in a stove that had not been fed hard in days. Flint stepped inside. He did not say anything for a moment. He walked to the north wall, the wall every house in the basin had lost to the cold, the wall Caleb's own wife had died beside in a different winter, and he pressed his bare palm flat against the inside of it. It was dry. It was warm. There was no frost on it and no breath of moving air, nothing at all but a wall full of held breath, doing exactly what an old woman from the high country had promised it would do. Dorsey Flint had built houses in Antelope Fork for 30 years. He took his hand off the wall, and he looked at the shepherd, and all the years of carpentry went quiet in him. All this time, he said, we built our walls solid, and we never once thought to fill them with nothing at all. Flint was not the last to come. As the basin dug itself out over that long, bright day, the path Flint had broken through the drifts to the wool house became a road, and one by one the doubters walked it. Asa Quill came, no ledger under his arm now, and stood in the warm doorway and could not meet the shepherd's eye, and asked quietly whether there was fleece to spare for a man who had marked him down as a risk. There was. Reverend Ott came, his certainty gone soft with frostbite and shame, and he did not speak of superstition. He stood at the warm north wall a long while, his hand against it, and when he turned around his face was wet. And all he said was that he had come to warn a man and had instead been taught by him. Old Tom Bessie came too, last of all, and Bessie did not press a hand to the wall, because Bessie had never doubted. He only looked around the warm room at the sleeping dog and the sound child and the small, untroubled fire, and he nodded once. The way a man nods when the season has answered a question he already knew the answer to, and he said the grandmother had been right, and that some knowledge was older and truer than the men too proud to learn it. Caleb did not gloat. He had no taste for it. He had buried the reason he knew this in the ground the winter before, and being right about it now brought him no pleasure, only a kind of tired peace. He put more wood on the fire, and he warmed the carpenter who had mocked him, and the ledger man who had doubted him, and the preacher who had pitied him. And before the day was out, he was out in the snow with his sledge, hauling fleece to the families along the south road, showing them how to open a wall and fill it and hold it up with battens so it would not settle. The wool he gave away for free. He had plenty. The valley had thought it was garbage. That winter took lives in the Dakota Territory. But it took none in Antelope Fork Basin, because before the second great storm of the season came down in January, half the cabins on the South Road had been opened and packed with held breath. And Caleb Renner walked from house to house, teaching hands that had laughed at him how to make a wall go still. The years went on the way years do. The Basin called it the Wool Wall after that, and then just the Still Wall, and the men who had ridden past the Renner fence shaking their heads taught their own sons to pack their cavities with fleece and hold it up with battens, and nobody after a while remembered that it had ever been a thing to laugh at. Dorsey Flint, who had built half the Basin solid, spent the rest of his working life building it still instead, and he never raised another wall without a cavity full of held breath in it. And when men asked him where he had learned the trick, he told them plainly that a shepherd had taught it to him in the worst winter of his life, and that the proudest thing he had ever done was admit he had been wrong at a warm wall. Caleb Renner never became a celebrated man. He kept his small flock and raised his daughter and grew old quietly in the warmest house in the valley, and Nell, when she married and built her own house up the Basin, packed every wall of it with wool before she ever lit a fire in it, and her children after her, and theirs. People rarely remembered the laughter in the end. They rarely remembered the names they had called him or the certainty in Dorsey Flint's voice at the fence that gray afternoon. What survived the winters was not the scorn. What survived was the thing that worked, passed hand to hand and house to house, a piece of folk knowledge carried by memory long after the men who first laughed at it were gone. The cold was never the killer. Moving air was the killer, and the man who finally understood that was not the strongest builder in the Basin or the proudest. He was only a grieving shepherd who had felt the cold reach his wife through a solid wall, and had been willing, when an old woman pressed a handful of dirty fleece into his hands, to finally listen. Do you think Caleb Renner was truly brilliant, or was he simply one of the few men willing to learn the hard lesson the cold had been teaching the whole valley all along? Let us know in the comments.